December 1989. A routine police chase through rural Mexico. A smuggler ran a checkpoint. Officers followed him down a dirt track between agricultural fields toward a remote ranch called Rancho Santa Elena. What they found there would become one of the most disturbing criminal discoveries in American history. Inside a dilapidated shack, they found a large iron cauldron surrounded by human bones. Inside it, a human brain. Days earlier, a university student's friends had been walking the streets of a border town with his photograph, asking everyone they saw if they recognized him. What started as a missing spring break student became something far worse. Mark James Kilroy was 21 years old in March 1989, born in Chicago, Illinois, but his family had moved to Texas and settled in Santa Fe, a small community about 30 miles south of Houston. He grew up Catholic. His parents were involved in church life, charitable work, community service. The kind of family where helping others wasn't an obligation. It was just how life was lived. In school he was academically strong, a scout, student council, baseball, basketball, golf. His teammates and closest friends, Bill, Bradley, and Brent, had been part of his life for years. By spring 1989, Mark was deep into his pre-med studies and looking toward a medical career. He'd earned a break. The plan was straightforward enough. South Padre Island with the three friends. Beach, sun, the usual chaos of spring break. Another friend named Ryan had been planning to come. He pulled out 48 hours before they left. He would later say he spent a long time thinking about that decision. They drove south to the Gulf in early March. The island was everything they'd wanted. Across the border from Brownsville, Texas sits Matamoros, Mexico. The bars and clubs were cheap, the nights long, and thousands of students crossed that border every spring break without incident. Mark and his friends crossed too. They met a group of girls from Kansas, ended up at a place called Sergeant Pepper's, drank and danced until 2:30 in the morning, then went back to their hotel on the American side. The following night, March 13th, they went back, left the car in the US, walked across the bridge, hit a couple of bars, El Sombrero, then another that had rebranded itself as Hard Rock to attract American students. At some point during the night, Mark briefly separated from the group to talk to a girl he'd met earlier at a tanning competition. He said goodbye to her and rejoined his friends. The four of them walked toward the bridge together, in good spirits, 200 feet from the American border. Bill stepped behind a tree in a small park to use the bathroom. While he was gone, he noticed a Mexican man gesturing to the group. He heard Mark's voice, something like, "Haven't I seen you somewhere before?" Bill assumed Mark knew the guy. He didn't think anything of it. When Bill finished and came back to Brent and Bradley, Mark wasn't there. They waited. They looked around. They assumed he'd caught a ride back with someone. It happened during spring break. They went back to the hotel. By morning, he hadn't returned. They called the police. The first days were treated as a routine missing persons report. Students disappeared temporarily all the time in border towns. But the days passed and Mark didn't surface, and investigators on both sides of the border began to treat it as something more serious. His description went to hospitals and jails. Nothing. 2 days in, investigators brought in a hypnotist. Under hypnosis, Bradley recalled seeing Mark speak to a young Latino man with a scar or mark on his cheek. The case got unusual attention because Mark's uncle worked for U.S. Customs in Los Angeles. A task force was assembled in Brownsville. Mexican authorities were initially reluctant and suggested Mark might have disappeared on the American side. His friends were emphatic that wasn't true. Mark's parents, Jim and Helen, came down and took over the search personally. They printed and distributed 20,000 flyers. They posted a $5,000 reward, which a local businessman raised to $15,000. On March 26th, the story ran on America's Most Wanted. Thousands of calls came in. None of them led anywhere. The Kilroys went home with nothing. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The break came not from the search, but from a routine checkpoint. On a Sunday afternoon in early April, a young man named Serafin Garcia ran a federal checkpoint. Serafin was the nephew of a local drug smuggler named Elio Rivera. Police followed him to the family operation, Rancho Santa Elena, 20 miles west of Matamoros. They found 64 pounds of marijuana. They found weapons. And one of the investigators noticed a small shack. On the floor, melted candles, cigarettes, bottles. Outside, large iron cauldrons. The Mexican investigator called in a spiritual healer before continuing the search. He believed the shack was a site of ritual practice and he wanted it cleansed first. The American investigators present found this frustrating. The Mexican investigator didn't see it as optional. When the search continued, Elio's family and the workers on the ranch were detained. One of the most significant people they took in was the caretaker. Once he was sure his bosses were in custody, he talked. He was shown a photograph of Mark Kilroy. He recognized him immediately. He said he'd seen Mark with his hands bound in the boot of a car at the ranch. In questioning, Elio, Serafin, and 2 others confessed to the abduction of Mark Kilroy and to witnessing his ritual killing. Serafin said he'd buried Mark, himself, and marked the grave with a wire sticking out of the ground. The wire was attached to Mark's spine, so that after decomposition, the vertebrae could be pulled out and used as a ritual necklace. Serafin dug under police supervision. There were multiple bodies. By midday, 12 had been recovered. 2 days later, dental records confirmed that Mark was among them. Elio Rivera's family had been running marijuana across the border for years. After the previous leader of the operation was killed in 1987, Elio took over. He believed in ritual protection, paying for spiritual power to guard the operation against police and rivals. The person he brought in to provide that protection was Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo, 26 years old, born in Miami to a Cuban mother, raised between Catholicism and Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Caribbean practice that involves animal sacrifice and ritual. He moved to Mexico City in 1984 and built a reputation among politicians, musicians, and drug traffickers as someone who could provide supernatural protection. He was charismatic. People were drawn to him. Elio offered him a share of the profits. Constanzo moved to the ranch. In 1988, he used it to store drugs and to perform rituals. The victims up to that point had mostly been rival traffickers. But in March 1989, Constanzo decided he needed something different. He ordered an Anglo-American university student. He believed sacrificing an educated American would provide complete immunity from law enforcement. This belief was so absolute that it helps explain why. Serafin ran that checkpoint without hesitation weeks later. He genuinely believed they couldn't be touched. The American he chose was Mark. Mark was bound and gagged with heavy tape. He was held in the shack for approximately 12 hours. He was told nothing would happen to him. He was given food, eggs, bread, water. Then he was taken outside. Constanzo killed him with a machete blow to the back of the neck. When his body was recovered, his legs had been severed above the knee. Serafin said this was simply to make burial easier. Inside the iron cauldron, police found a charred human brain mixed with blood and human and animal remains. Mark's brain was among them. The other victims included a police officer, a volunteer, and a 16-year-old boy. Constanzo fled by plane to Mexico City after the ranch was discovered. He had an apartment there. In late April, investigators burned the shack and destroyed the iron cauldron. An anthropologist they consulted suggested that Constanzo, wherever he was, would lose his psychological stability when he learned his ritual space had been destroyed. The theory was that it might draw him out. What it produced instead was paranoia. Constanzo began sleeping in short intervals. He carried an Uzi. He was burning money and throwing cash from his window. Meanwhile, police in Mexico City were searching an apartment building for a missing child. Completely unrelated to this case. Because of his state of mind, Constanzo became convinced they were coming for him. He started throwing bundles of banknotes from the window. Residents noticed. So did police. They redirected toward apartment 13. When they got close, Constanzo opened fire with the Uzi. A 40-minute armed confrontation followed. One officer was wounded. It ended with Constanzo dead inside the apartment. The trial in Mexico concluded in May 1994. The key figures, Elio Rivera, Serafin Garcia, and others, received sentences of 67 years. Mark's parents established the Mark Kilroy Foundation, dedicated to drug abuse prevention. His father wrote a book called Sacrifice. All profits went to the foundation. Mark Kilroy was 21 years old. He was 200 feet from the American border. He said, "Haven't I seen you somewhere before?" And that was the last anyone heard from him. If this case stayed with you, and it should, subscribe to Cold Trails. Every week we cover the cases where the trail went cold, but never disappeared. I'll see you in the dark.